Commanders have a new head coach. We've been waiting for this announcement.
He wasn't the first guy that the Commanders actually wanted to go with. I wonder how he feels about that.
Defensive coordinator and Atlanta Falcons head coach Dan Quinn.
I don't think there's a single team in the entire NFL that has had a more up and down offseason so far than the Washington Commanders. There's so much good that's been going on so far in their offseason, yet at the same time, it's been mixed with disappointment. So before we get to the content, make sure you drop like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to help the channel grow. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! For the Super Bowl, PrizePicks is blessing us with an easy way to make $100. All Patrick Mahomes needs is one passing yard in the Super Bowl for a square to hit, which means he's pretty much a free square. First, download PrizePicks and use my promo code Mikerophone when you sign up to get up to $100 deposit match on your initial deposit, and then make these picks really quickly before they change the lines on them. So for me, I'm pairing Mahomes' free square with Isaiah Pacheco, who's had at least one touchdown in his last 5 games, so that's easy, and Christian McCaffrey, who has had more than 88.5 rushing yards in 4 of his last 5 games. Of course, I give away all my picks for free on Instagram, and I highly recommend you turn on notifications for my Instagram story so you can get the picks quickly before they move the lines and you lose your advantage. And thank you, PrizePicks, for the sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? I know everybody's gonna look at this video and say,
"Oh, Mike's a Cowboy fan. He's probably gonna start hating on the Washington Commanders."
But if you watched each and every single upload this offseason so far, you'd notice how I praised the Washington Commanders for all of their decisions. They finally got rid of the cancer that was Dan Snyder, bringing in Josh Harris as the brand new owner of the Washington Commanders. But in addition to that, you get a blue chip general manager in Adam Peters. You trade Chase Young and Montez Sweat during the trade deadline, and as a result, you have about $70 million in cap space and the number 2 overall pick in this year's NFL draft. On top of that, there's a bunch of blue chip head coaches available to you in this year's coaching carousel. Pete Carroll's available, Bill Belichick's available, Mike Vrabel's available, hell, Ben Johnson, this 37-year-old head coach who looks like an offensive mastermind for the Detroit Lions, is available, and he is at the very top of your radar. Why would he not be interested in your position? After all, you have a lot of cap space, a blue chip general manager, the number 2 overall pick, which is probably going to be Drake May in this particular instance, a wonderful wide receiver core, a very talented running back in Brian Robinson. In my opinion, there is no reason at all whatsoever why an individual would not want the Washington Commanders head coaching position. It seems like a home run job at this point. But in the case of the Washington Commanders, they already made a horrific mistake. You see, the Washington Commanders decided to wait as long as they possibly could because they were absolutely sure they wanted Ben Johnson as their next head coach. Now, I know what Washington Commander fans are going to say.
Mike, they said that Ben Johnson wasn't their top candidate.
Well, if Ben Johnson wasn't their top candidate, why did they wait until this point in the head coaching cycle to hire a head coach? It doesn't make any sense. No team's going to come out and say,
"We wanted Ben Johnson and we waited for him, but he left us at the altar. Now we're hiring our second or third choice."
No team is going to come out and say that. So a few weeks ago, the Washington Commanders fired their head coach, Ron Rivera, a head coach that is very accomplished, has a remarkable story, and very respected in the NFL. A head coach that is 62 years old and was hired by the previous regime. From here, they had multiple options. Upon firing Ron Rivera, everybody knew that the top choice for the Washington Commanders was Ben Johnson. So the Washington Commanders waited and waited and waited, and when Ben Johnson left them at the altar, they still had some very good options left on the table. For instance, there was Mike Vrabel, who, in my opinion, should not have been fired as the Tennessee Titans head coach. A lot of Titans fans have been telling me that the main reason he got fired was he was a huge yes man and he hired a lot of his friends, and that got in the way of him doing his job properly. But if you just look at his track record, this man came, resurrected a team, and was very successful until said team decided to trade their best offensive weapon to the Philadelphia Eagles. On top of that, you have Bill Belichick, a head coach that is widely considered to be the greatest head coach in NFL history, that has been the architect of some of the NFL's greatest defenses. The problem is he's 70, and there's a slight chance that he was able to leverage the greatest decision he's ever made in his head coaching career to consistently winning over the next 2 decades. And once Tom Brady left, things really started to hit the fan for him. And he's already proven to us that he's not necessarily the greatest individual whenever it comes to rebuilding rosters, and he may be a little bit too involved in the front office. But then you have other options as well, such as Eric Bieniemy, an individual that has consistently been named in head coaching searches. This would be the perfect opportunity to elevate him to head coach. There aren't really any other offensive coordinators available for hire. Gerard Johnson got that extension. Bobby Slowick also got an extension. But Eric Bieniemy was a blue chip head coaching candidate a few years ago, and a lot of people don't understand why he's never gotten his opportunity. This could be his opportunity, and at the very worst, if it doesn't work out, you could fire him at the end of next year. And then there's Dan Quinn, an individual that would probably be the least exciting hire of them all. Now, I know what people are thinking.
Mike, you're only saying that because Dan Quinn choked in the wild card versus the Green Bay Packers.
I personally have a lot of love for Dan Quinn. Whenever I think of Dan Quinn, I don't think about his final game with the Dallas Cowboys. I think of what he did for the Cowboys. Coming in the year after we had the worst defense in the NFL, Mike Nolan, utilizing Micah Parsons in a way that we've never seen before in NFL history, moving him along the defensive line, playing him in multiple positions, building one of the most feared defenses in the NFL around Micah Parsons. You saw exciting defensive plays from Trevon Diggs whenever he was healthy, and this past year, Deron Bland. The Cowboys' identity became their defense, and we have Dan Quinn to thank for that. And I'm not going to just look at his final game with the Dallas Cowboys and say good riddance because, well, I think he was an incredible defensive coordinator. The problem is his head coaching pedigree doesn't really excite many individuals. Dan Quinn is most famous for his Super Bowl loss to the New England Patriots, where they blew a 28-3 lead when he was the head coach of the Atlanta Falcons during the 2016 season. And the thing that was really interesting was it seemed like the moment that the Atlanta Falcons lost that Super Bowl, they just started blowing leads left and right. It was truly bizarre to see. The craziest one was in week 2 of his final season with the Atlanta Falcons versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys recovered this onside kick in the most bizarre way, and they were able to beat the Atlanta Falcons last second. This resulted in an 0-5 start in Dan Quinn's final season with the Falcons. He would coach 3 games after that Dallas Cowboys choke, and then he would get hired by the Cowboys as their defensive coordinator and would completely rebuild his reputation. So who would the Washington Commanders end up going with? Well, it was Dan Quinn, and a lot of people aren't happy about this. So according to Adam Schefter and Ian Rappaport, from Dallas to DC, the Commanders are hiring Cowboys defensive coordinator Dan Quinn as their head coach per league sources. Quinn and Commanders GM Adam Peters are the 2 men now charged with leading Washington into the future. A lot of Commanders fans are a little frustrated at the fact that Adam Peters hasn't really had the greatest first 2 weeks of his Washington Commanders career. I mean, he missed out on Ben Johnson, but granted, Ben Johnson wanted an obscene amount of money. Missed out on Mike McDonald. He didn't have a plan B for his head coaching search. He was only locked in on Ben Johnson, and he ended up hiring Dan Quinn, who a lot of people are essentially calling Ron Rivera 2.0, which I don't think it's really fair to call him that, but I can understand why Commanders fans are very disappointed. At the same time, I'd be wondering, why didn't they hire Bill Belichick? Well, according to Diana Rossini, during the hiring process in Washington, Bill Belichick was considered for the job. The Commanders spoke with him, and he had support from some decision makers. In the end, Dan Quinn is their choice. I want to speak about this from the Dan Quinn perspective and the Commanders perspective. From the Commanders perspective, it's clear that they didn't really have a true plan B. You don't fire Ron Rivera and say, okay, maybe if we're lucky, we're going to get Dan Quinn as our head coach. No, he was your backup plan. And the reason why I don't like this hire is you're essentially moving on from a defensive-minded head coach that made it to a Super Bowl but lost in the Super Bowl, that was on his second team, for a defensive-minded head coach that pretty much has a similar resume. And that's no disrespect to Dan Quinn, because I have so much appreciation and love for what he's done for the Cowboys defense, but this was clearly not the Washington Commanders' top candidate, and at that point, I would have just elevated Eric Bieniemy. From the perspective of Dan Quinn, this is probably the greatest head coaching position that you could get. Again, the Commanders, $70 million in cap space, a offensive coordinator that I believe in. I really think Eric Bieniemy could put Drake May or whoever they take at the quarterback position with the number 2 overall pick in a great position to succeed. That offense is loaded with Jahan Dotson, Brian Robinson, and Terry McLaurin. So from that perspective, I think this is a great gig. And hell, You remember when Micah Parsons said that wherever Dan Quinn goes, he might take Micah with him? Well, Jahan Dotson already began recruiting Micah Parsons as a result of him saying that. Micah, I love you, bro, but we gotta work on those mic skills, really. So at that point, there's a lot of questions about who the Cowboys' next defensive coordinator could be. A lot of people are saying it could potentially be Joe Witt Jr., who said that one of his dream jobs was to be the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. But it seems like Dan Quinn is also going to take Joe Witt Jr. with him to the Washington Commanders and elevate him to defensive coordinator, so he's going to get a nice little upgrade as well. The most likely candidate to replace Dan Quinn for the Dallas Cowboys is Ron Rivera, so we're essentially making a trade with the Commanders if you think about it, but the Cowboys are set to interview Ron Rivera next week. And I hope our defense doesn't fall off that much as a result of losing Dan Quinn, because he did a remarkable job and that most definitely could happen. But from the perspective of being a Commanders fan, I doubt that they're very excited about this. It's like this individual says, the biggest problem that the Commanders will have selling this is that Quinn is a lot like Ron Rivera. They may not be the same guy, but they can be found in the same aisle 3 feet apart at the grocery store. Defensive-minded, player-friendly, well-liked, leader of men types. Both had middling success in the NFC South first go-around and got to the Super Bowl that time. Quinn likes to say, be where your feet are. But at the same time, you can make another argument. Over the past 4 years, Washington invested a ton of draft capital in defense, and it didn't really yield any dividends. You can make an argument that the Washington Commanders defense is significantly stronger than their offense, and they just need the right individual that could get the most out of their defense. So maybe the pairing of Dan Quinn with Eric Bieniemy is exactly what Washington needs in order to contend. But I'm sure every Washington fan will admit they're not necessarily super excited about this hire. But at the end of the day, I want to just remind you guys that typically the hype that you get from a hiring in the offseason doesn't necessarily translate to victories. I mean, do you guys remember how hyped people were when the Jacksonville Jaguars hired Urban Meyer and how revolutionary it was going to be? And then it ended up being a huge disaster. What about when the New York Jets decided to select Zach Wilson with the number 2 overall pick? He was supposed to be their savior. Or how about more recently when the New York Jets traded for Aaron Rodgers? That didn't really work out in year 1 at the very least. So we'll have to see if this ends up working out for the Washington Commanders. It definitely is a mistake on Adam Peters' part to not have a clear-cut plan B. I really wish Dan Quinn the best as the head coach of the Washington Commanders, and maybe he's going to help resurrect this team and restore it to its former glory almost 40 years ago. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.